Welcome, folks. My name is Daniel. We'll be getting started shortly. We're just going to let a few more people arrive, and we'll get going in just a few minutes. Thanks for joining.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Daniel, solo quería darles la bienvenida. Vamos a comenzar en algunos minutos, solo les quería dar la bienvenida.
Welcome, folks. My name is Daniel. Welcome to the Food Sovereignty for Santa Barbara webinar. My name is Daniel Parra-Hensel. I'll be tonight's MC, and we'll be introducing our guest presenters shortly. First, I would just like to hand it off to our live interpreters, Lena at Bridging Voices, to just get us set up for tonight's interpretation. Lena, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Daniel. Gracias. Hi, everybody. This is a bilingual message. It will be repeated in English. Hola a todos. Este es un mensaje bilingüe y será repetido en inglés. Muy buenas tardes. Para facilitar el acceso lingüístico, proporcionaremos interpretación simultánea entre inglés y español. Mi nombre es Lena. Estoy aquí con mi colega Steve. Seremos sus intérpretes. Si usted es bilingüe, no tiene que presionar nada. Si usted no es bilingüe en inglés y en español, elegir el idioma en el que desea escuchar la interpretación. Si nos acompaña a través de computadora, verá un icono en forma de globo en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. Haga clic en ese globo de interpretación y seleccione español. Si nos acompaña a través de la aplicación de Zoom en su tableta o teléfono, busque el menú de 3 puntos en la parte superior derecha de la pantalla, haga clic en la interpretación de idiomas y elija español. Y ahora en inglés. Good afternoon, everybody. In order to facilitate language access, we will be providing simultaneous interpretation between English and Spanish. My name is Lena. I'm here with my colleague Steve, who will be your interpreters for the evening. The instructions we gave are that if you are bilingual in English and Spanish, you don't have to press anything. But for folks who are not bilingual, they'll need to select the language that they wish to hear interpretation in. So if folks are joining us from a PC or laptop, you'll see a globe icon at the bottom part of the screen. You'll click there. You would select Spanish. If you are joining us through the Zoom application on a tablet or phone, locate the 3-dot menu on the top right, click on language interpretation, and again, select Spanish. And we just like to remind our speakers as well to all please speak only one at a time and at a moderate pace. And I will now ask our host to please assign me as second interpreter. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lena. Okay, so welcome, everybody. Again, my name is Daniel Parra-Hensel. I'm tonight's MC for the webinar, and I'll briefly just describe myself for purposes of access today. I'm a male presenting, dark long hair, brown skin, and I have a beard. I'm wearing glasses and a green shirt that says Planting Justice on it. And I have my background blurred out so you can't see my room. I'm calling in today from Siutun, also known as Santa Barbara, as a guest on unceded Chumash land. And in regards to the webinar tonight in this project, I'm one of the project leads for the Santa Barbara Ecological and Edible Gardens project. I'm also adjunct faculty here at the Santa Barbara City College, where I teach courses in agroecology, permaculture design, and ecological justice. And lastly, I'm the director of applied agroecology for the Somos Semillas Food Sovereignty Project here in Santa Barbara. Just a little history on this project. The Santa Barbara Ecological and Edible Garden Project started at the City College with partnership with Explore Ecology and 5 other community partners and projects. In 2019, we created a network of community gardens, permaculture gardens that are aiming to promote bio and cultural diversity, increase access to locally grown food, and foster a connection between community and ecosystems and ecology. Our partner sites consist of the Santa Barbara City College Permaculture Garden, Explore Ecology Garden, school sites, Santa Barbara Boys and Girls Club, Mesa Harmony Garden, Youth Drought Project, the Santa Barbara Botanic Gardens, and the Somos Semillas Food Sovereignty Garden. If you'd like to learn more about this project, you can check out the link in the chat that I will send to everybody now, so you can learn more about that. I'm also just going to quickly drop the rough agenda so you can have a little roadmap for tonight's webinar, what to expect. In a moment, hopefully we'll be doing our land acknowledgement if we can get Mia Lopez on the call. She's having a little bit of difficulty getting on. And if not, we'll wait till she gets on and do the land acknowledgement at some point later. Quickly, as far as captioning, we do have captioning provided for this webinar this afternoon. So in the Zoom window near the bottom right, you should be able to click on the captioning icon and play with the text and get different sizes needed if you need. This webinar is being recorded, so you can we'll send out a link in the future. And if people weren't able to make it, they can watch it soon. I've just been invited to slow down, so I will slow down. Thank you for that. And I also lastly wanted to mention that we have a dear friend and comrade, Chewy, the Director of Food and Culture for Somos Semillas, and they will be monitoring the Q&A feature tonight. So please feel free to ask questions throughout all the presentations, and we'll try to monitor them so that the last 20 minutes during our Q&A, we can draw upon some of those questions, and then people can continue to ask while we're actually in the Q&A. I don't believe, wow, Mia Lopez just signed on right now. Perfect timing. Hey, Mia, welcome. I don't know if you can see me.
Aku.
I was literally just at the point where I was gonna hand it off to you to do the land acknowledgement if you're ready.
Oh, great. I would love to.
Okay.
All right. Aku. Mia kakti kapapane shumolo ki chumarsi hisiksun ke aswahil hilna halamog milimu. Kascho kapkamuli. Hello, everyone. My name is Mia Lopez. My ancestral Chumash villages are Sikston and Limu, Swahil on our island of Limu. And I'm very happy that you're all here today. I would like to begin and take this opportunity to ask us all to reflect on how the work we do here today and every day in our chosen fields affects these lands and the peoples of these lands. We come together today to stand up for and give voice to the unceded land of the Chumash peoples and declare our indigenous sovereignty. I ask you in joining me in acknowledging our Chumash communities, our elders, both past, present, and our future generations. These lands were founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land we sit on today. As we work together to prevent further damage to these lands that support our livelihoods, recreation, and lifestyles, please remember that the Chumash people have been separated from these lands, unable to maintain our livelihoods as we should, unable to recreate traditionally, and unable to maintain our traditional lifeways freely. The damage that has been done and continues to be done by drilling, fracking, erasure of our people, miseducation of our youth can never be erased.
There is no mitigation that can make our communities whole again. But together we can do better. As community, we can acknowledge the mistakes and atrocities of the past, move forward in remembrance and relationship with the local Chumash and all Indigenous people to begin the process of healing by making sure that the process is here and everywhere we are. Make room for Chumash voices to be heard and other Indigenous voices, for their traditional knowledge of these territories and other territories be listened to, and that our people can be a part of the healing of these lands as well as ourselves. This acknowledgement is a call to action to all of our partners here to begin the process of creating a relationship with the local Chumash communities and the Indigenous people wherever you may be, and to work to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Thank you so much for being here. As the newly elected tribal chair for the coastal band of the Chumash Nation, I would like to just remind us all that we are all family, we are all relatives, and a lot of time in our food sovereignty work, we talk about our relatives from the South, and what we forget is that along with the Indigenous people of California, our relatives to the South have been trading with us for a really long time. Our rhetoric here in Western society is to call them immigrants, migrant workers, illegal, things like that, when in fact, these borders that were put upon us are illegal. We were never asked if they could be put here. These borders have no bearing on our relationships and the people that we are and our relatives. So please remember that we are all here together in this place, and it takes us all to remind each other of these slights of history, these atrocities, as I said, that have happened to us and separated us as people. And I hope that we can all come together to remember that our connection to each other is through our connection to the land. And if we can reconnect to the land and remember our plants as relatives, then we can also open our hearts to remember that we are each relatives to each other and start taking better care of people, places, and our waters and animals. So thank you all for being here and doing this good work. And thank you for allowing me this time to open up and bring us all together. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mia. Really appreciate your presence here. And I
Thank you,
just,
Daniel.
yeah, just want to share that we, with the Somos Semillas Garden Project, we had Mia do our blessing welcoming when we first started the project and do a planting. So it's really sweet to continue the relationship and continue to grow together. Well, all right, I'm gonna just transition over to tonight's presenters. We have 4 amazing guest presenters tonight that will be talking about economic, housing, language, and Indigenous sovereignty. I'm gonna just briefly introduce all 4 back to back, and then I'll hand it off to the first presenter. So our first presenter will be Gopal Dayaneni. Gopal is one of the co-founders of the Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project and has been working on economic and ecological sovereignty for over 30 years. Tonight, he will be giving us an overview of economic sovereignty and giving us a meta framing for the economic and ecological justice work that he's a part of. Our second presenter will be Sada Habib. Sada is the creator of Home Sovereignty Studio, which is dedicated to remembering our ancestral, spiritual, and land-based wisdoms as paths towards liberation of community health and cultural arts. Sada will be sharing on housing sovereignty and will be grounding us in some natural building work as an ancestral birthright. Our third presenter is Sarah Coyo Moreno. Coyo is the site project coordinator for the Ventura chapter of the Owens Valley Career Development Center, based out of Bishop, California. Koya has been committed to re-indigenizing our communities and will share on their work with language revitalization and rematriation tonight. And our first presenter tonight is Melissa Nelson. Melissa is a professor of Indigenous Sustainability at Arizona State in their School of Sustainability. She is an Indigenous ecologist, writer, editor, media maker, and scholar activist. Tonight, Melissa will be presenting on Indigenous sovereignty and traditional ecological knowledge. Before I pass it on to our first presenter, I just want to remind folks to speak slowly for our interpreters. And I just want to send another gratitude to all of you who are here tonight and to the presenters for being here. Gopal, whenever you're ready.
Hello, hello, and thank you, Daniel and everyone for being here and joining us. My name is Gopal Dayaneni. I use he, him pronouns. I am speaking to you from Ramaytush Ohlone territories from the campus of San Francisco State University, where I am now teaching. And sometimes I have to move my arms to get the lights to go back on. But I reside in Huichin, unceded Chochenyo speaking Ohlone territories. I live in an intentional community of 4 families along the Temescal Creek. It is also the birthplace of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, known as Oakland, California. And I am really honored and excited to be here today. I am going to share some slides and offer a little bit of framing around some of the work that I've been involved in around building new economy and creating commons of capital. But first, I just want to acknowledge that I'm just blessed to share space today with these amazing organizers. And Melissa is someone from whom I've learned so much over the years, and just a blessing always to be in space with you. So I just want to name that and before I start. So I am going to share my slides, and hopefully I'll be able to do this effectively. And if for any reason I am not showing the proper thing, someone can let me know in the chat. I'm going to take us on a little bit of a journey as I get started here. In part, it's going to be a little roundabout, but I hope it makes sense. I want to start with the notion of ecology and economy. Just very briefly, that word ecology, I think most folks probably know the little eco means home, and ecosystems are, the system means relationships. Ecosystems are relationships of home, and the complex of those relationships and those interactions. And I think this is a really important starting point, because the thing that matters most to all of us, and the thing that it should be the foundation of everything we do and how we approach our work and the world, is relationships. It is the relationships that matter. And the dominant worldview, the dominant culture and cosmology wants us to reduce the world to objects. And instead, we must see the world and everything as just reflections of complex relationships. Even ideas, the idea that anyone has an idea is absurd. Ideas are an expression of symbiosis, an expression of relationships, of interactions. So even that for me is about relationship fundamentally. And ecology is the knowledge or study of home, and economy is the one I want to focus on today, which is the stewardship or management or care of home, literally. and these all come from the Greek oikos, meaning home or household. Economy is not buying and selling and stocks and bonds. It is not GDP. It is not growth. It is not whether the Dow Jones is up or down. It is simply the care of our relationships of home. And there are so many diverse forms of economy that we have been engaged in and continue to be engaged in every day, not just the one dominant form of extractive economy that endlessly takes and dominates and degrades our relationships to each other and our relationships to the rest of the living world. So I want to start with that. The economy isn't, there's no the economy. If you've ever, stopped whatever you were doing and went to take care of a friend who is sick, or to help them with their kids, or took care of somebody on the street who you saw needed help, you were engaging in the care of your relationships of home, whether or not it's valued by the dominant economy. And many of our communities organize economy to meet our needs, despite the dominant economies. So, for example, thriving economies of care and mutual care among undocumented folks who are radically excluded from many aspects of the mainstream economy or the dominant economy, right? So mutual aid, disaster collectivism, moments of crises where people come together and take care of each other is all part of economies that may not be valued and may not even serve the dominant economy. And all economies are nested in ecosystems. All economies have an ecological basis. We engage with the rest of the living world to create economy. And because all economies are nested in ecosystems, and we are nested in economies, we can only ever experience the world around us as it is mediated for us by the economy in which we are in. That's why I say there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Because a 5.0 earthquake where I live might break some dishes or wake me up in the middle of the night or might scare me. But a 5.0 earthquake in Bangladesh could easily collapse a sweatshop and kill 1,500 people. It is not that the earthquake discriminates, it's that the economy does. And you will only ever experience the earthquake as it travels through the economy. And an unfair, inequitable economy will unfairly and inequitably distribute the consequences. And it doesn't matter whether it's an earthquake or a superstorm or climate change or a pandemic. An unfair economy will unfairly distribute the consequences. We only ever experience the soil outside of our home, whether the economy paved over it or not. Our access to the notions of wilderness or escape are all economic relationships. So this is a really important, a concept for us in terms of how we're thinking about this and this notion of the unfair economy. Okay, if I could, if this was like a more, if we had everybody in the space with us, I'd ask you these questions, and I want you to consider these questions as you're listening in. Do you believe that housing is a human right? And I imagine everybody in this webinar is going to raise their hand or believe, agrees with that. And then the other question here, do you believe that healthcare is a human right? And I think most of us probably raise our hands. I hope everybody does. And I want to just make a quick point about these two things. If you believe that housing is a human right, then you also must believe that any economic activity which infringes upon that right or restricts that right is wrong. In fact, rights are not given and rights are not taken away. Rights are inherent, they are exercised, and they are only ever violated, and that is the origin of violence. So if you believe that everyone has a right to housing, then you must also believe that the nature of the economy must be organized to ensure that need. And anything which infringes upon that need is essentially a form of violence. If you believe that healthcare is a human right, I can ask you, close your eyes and imagine what universal healthcare is like. And most of us imagine things like being able to go and get healthcare when we need it, to not worry about insurance, to not have to pay, to be able to get the treatments or the medicines that we need. But there's another really important thing to consider. If you believe that everyone has a right to healthcare, then the way we actually organize healthcare must ensure that nobody's health or well-being is compromised through that process. So if you imagine, if you believe that healthcare is a right of all people, then you must also reimagine healthcare and reimagine health and well-being to ensure that everyone can have it. Because the nature of healthcare that we currently take for assume when we think of universal healthcare in places like the so-called United States presumes that we can have access to titanium hips and lots of electronic diagnostics and all kinds of resources that depend upon the extraction of wealth from other peoples in other places and peoples even in our own communities. We can think of the current healthcare system as a transfer of life expectancy from poor people in the global South to rich people in the global North. It's even a transfer of life expectancy from a Black woman 3 zip codes away or 3 blocks away to a rich white person in the hills 3 blocks away. You can understand these. You can understand these relationships as reflections of the inequality in that very system. And so the very nature of that system has to change. And why do I bring this up? Because if you believe in rights, then the economy has to actually be organized in subordination to those rights. So I'm getting to my comments, getting to the capital piece. I got 5 minutes. I want to focus not on those kinds of individual rights that I used as examples, but what I consider collective rights. Rights of Mother Earth, the rights of living systems to operate with integrity and to be protected and defended, and the related, what we call new economic rights. This idea that communities, these collective rights, not the right of individuals, but the right of communities to the resources required to create productive, dignified, and ecologically sustainable livelihoods. And that is actually how our peoples have organized our relationship to land, organized our relationship to land and to all our relations in the living world forever. It is only recently that that has changed. Right? I want to point out that this is different than the right to healthcare or the right to housing or the right to a living wage. It's the right to create those conditions for ourselves in our communities. It is essentially the right of sovereignty of peoples. And if you believe that we have the right to those resources or life sources, as we like to think of them, and that they must be ecologically sustainable. That means they must be sustained over generations. Then you also must believe that the form of governance for those resources, the way we organize the economy around those resources, has to ensure that. And one way to describe that is the notion of commons. So the economy, one way to think about this is the idea that if we believe in collective rights or even individual rights, if we believe in rights, and I mean in the most fundamental sense, not in the sense of somebody wrote a law that gave you a right, quote unquote. I mean the inherence of rights. Then economy is our collective mechanism for taking responsibility. The economy is the mechanism by which we collectively take responsibility or not for rights. And in the dominant extractive economy, we do not. But we can. And that is, I think, the shared subject of our talk today is this notion of sovereignty. And essentially, one way to think about that for me is commons. And the notion of commons-based governance, the idea of common pool resources, resources that a community, a peoples depend upon, can be self-governed in a way that that creates opportunity and access, and also sustains it over time, over generations. And all commons is fundamentally rooted in consent and cooperation. And the infringement upon the commons is enclosure. That first I get just a couple of examples here. There's commoning that happens all over the world. We all participate in commons. Often we don't even realize it. But food sovereignty is a kind of commoning of food. And I believe we can have commons of anything and everything. My work is around commons of capital, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but we have mechanisms to create commons of land as opposed to the private enclosure of land. Energy democracy is an expression of the commons of energy. The idea of community owned, controlled, and operated energy. These are all expressions of commoning. Enclosures, on the other hand, are predicated on entitlement and exclusion. That's why I have a picture of the queen. The queen gives you a title, and literally duke or duchess or whatever. And with that title, you are allowed to enclose the commons. You get to create an enclosure of the commons. And an enclosure doesn't mean nobody has access. It means those with the title get to determine under what terms and conditions others have access. It's not if it's my enclosure, nobody can access it. It's that I get to determine how people access it. So the first point here is all enclosures are inherently enforced through violence. Doesn't matter whether it's the fence around my house, my private property home that's enforced by the cops, or the border around the nation state, which is enforced by the military. And there are all different kinds of enclosures. There's intellectual enclosures, like intellectual property or byline real estate. There's financial enclosures, which is the one I'm going to talk about in a second. There's the enclosure of land through private property. There's the enclosure of the body. There's even enclosures of identity through things like gender. So I deeply am committed to an anti-enclosure movement. And if we believe in creating an economy based on care and cooperation, it requires commoning instead of enclosure. I'm going to use a quick metaphor. Anybody ever heard the expression, grass is always greener on the other side of the fence? That's a little cow. I think we've made a mistake when we think about how we meet people's needs, that we notice that there is enclosure. And we have thought to ourselves, how do we get access to the resources that are enclosed. How do we get access to the fence? And so the metaphor I want to use is the cow. The cow is really excited to get on the other side of inside the fence to access the greener grass on the inside of the enclosure. So the people who control the fence, the person who controls the enclosure, might open up the gate and let the cow in and then close the fence. And now the cow is on the inside of the enclosure, enjoying the fresh green grass, waiting to become beef. The very nature of accessing the enclosure comes with terms and conditions that make you the resource from which you are extracted. You need access to housing, so they make a little opening in the enclosure of private property. You get to enter through rent, and you are now the resource that is extracted from in the form of your need for housing through rent. So the mistake we've often made is just trying to get access to that which is enclosed as opposed to tearing down the enclosure. So the work that we're all trying to do is about how we rebel against the enclosures of the nation state, the enclosures of capital, the enclosures of land, the enclosures of identity, the enclosures of language. So it used to be that we think about the enclosure of land as the grand enclosure, of course, which it is, but I want to name that now finance has become the mechanism by which we enclose capital, the resource, which is one of those essential resources, at least in this moment. And when I say capital, I don't mean money. Capital is just a degraded form of clean air, fresh water, our time and labor, and healthy soil. And it's reduced to financial capital in this system. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do and organize around is rebelling against that enclosure by creating this idea of a commons of capital. And so I'm part of a group that started something called the Seed Commons, which is a federation of now about 30 revolving loan funds all over the country that are financing worker and community-owned cooperative enterprises. But the form of finance is to create a commons of capital in the community, where the way we do lending subordinates debt to the people as opposed makes capital a tool for the people rather than people a tool of capital. This idea of non-extractive finance. And it's called the Seed Commons because it's based on a seed commons. You borrow a seed library, you borrow seed, you plant seeds, you grow food. You don't return the seeds you borrowed, you return the seeds from what you grew. You always return more seed than you borrowed, and you help grow the seed library. And you're a member of the seed library, which means you help manage it, govern it, care for it, and you help get more seed out into the community. So all of these local revolving loan funds, we're now a cooperative of cooperatives that are putting out $25 million currently in supporting worker and community-owned cooperatives, clean energy projects, ecological construction cooperatives, land projects. We also have People's Solar Energy Fund, which is a solar cooperative, financing cooperative. And they're all based on this idea of governing as commons, shared knowledge and learning, shared infrastructure, shared governance, and shared resources, shared capital. There's one in Southern California. There's the LA Co-op Lab. There's the Our Power Loan Fund. There's here in the Bay Area and the San Francisco Bay Estuary area, we have Cooperation Richmond. And I'll leave you with one last thought, and then I'm gonna shut up, which is usually a person who quotes former Supreme Court justices, but Louis Brandeis said once, we can either have democracy in this country or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. And I think part of the larger question of sovereignty for all of us is going to be a question of economic democracy, community control of resources and power. And with that, I will shut up.
Awesome. Thank you, Gopal. That's always super powerful stuff. Yeah, just a reminder to folks, drop questions in the Q&A and we'll monitor them and get to them towards the end. And up next, we have Sada Habib, if you're ready to do the housing sovereignty piece.
Everyone. Thank you for being here, and I'm really excited to share space with such inspiring organizers. And sorry, I was trying to share the screen, but I realized I couldn't access turning on my video and sound, so I will try that now. Okay. Yes, so my name is Sara Saumai Habib, and I am calling in from Ogapoge, also known as Santa Fe, New Mexico, Tewa territory. And I'll be sharing a little bit about ideas around home sovereignty, mostly focused on housing, natural materials and traditional materials, as well as relationship to land and land tending and farming. So I invite you to all take a few deep breaths and imagine this. Communities have everything they need: abundant choices and the right to self-determination in answering the what, where, who, how, and why of home and belonging, moving away from individualism towards mutual liberation and thriving. When it comes to housing, everyone would be housed. Housing would be a human and cultural right. We would have choices with building types, processes, rituals, and materials. And so just thinking of that last line, I'm reminded of what Porter Swensel says, that home is our inheritance, and that we all come from very recent lineages, if not current lineages, that have a close relationship to where the place that they live, and are able to tend that land as well as cultivate and build and maintain their own homes. So you'll see here, because I'm in New Mexico now and also participating in these practices, these are photos from the early 1900s, showing women who are mud plastering traditional adobe buildings. And you'll see both native Pueblo women as well as settler communities. And these practices have been here for millennia, and have been adapted in different ways, and are still practiced today, but not as commonly as before due to a lot of different barriers that I will talk about a little later. And here is a photo of a few of us last summer. We were tending to an acequia in Cienega, New Mexico. And so acequias are basically very, very old technology, and it's still being used here of basically ditches and canals. So carving networks in the earth to create ways to route water from main sources for collective water stewardship, basically. And so this is a vital old technology still being used in New Mexico, which is in a high desert climate. So as I continue to participate in practices like mud plastering, adobe, and collective water stewardship days, on the lands I am a guest on, I am reminded of where I grew up many miles from here, a little country called Kuwait, and very similar technologies were used for housing and sustaining life. So this is an aerial, also in the early 1900s of Kuwait, and it shows an aerial view of a lot of courtyard adobe buildings. And it's striking how similar it looks and feels all the way here. But this all drastically changed with imperial interests and the discovery of oil. The shared desert climate across oceans were instructions alongside colonization and migration. So I kind of want to ground back into why are we even talking about sovereignty and why this conversation is so important. It really is through these lived experiences and hearing stories from elders, grandparents, and parents who come from places now known as Vietnam and Iraq. My elders, I've come to learn how only just a few generations ago, my ancestors lived close to the land. Yet this relationship was strategically severed and distorted, mainly and most recently through imperial wars. Through these conditions, my perspective is one of diaspora, firm rootedness in bridging and remembering. I've come to understand how settler colonialism here on Turtle Island enables imperialism abroad. And how our ability to be responsible to and relate to place and the larger web of life must be reestablished. As a collective I'm involved with, Soulfire Farm Collective, says, in order to build the just and sustainable world we desire, we need more than theoretical ideas. We need to know how to produce the material conditions for community survival: food, shelter, trade, and medicine, or we will remain entirely dependent on exploitative colonial capitalist systems. And so with these insights, I always return back to the land and understanding how we truly do belong to the land, and how land shapes cultures and cultures shape beauty as well as resistance and resilience. It also shapes how we work, how we relate to the plants and animals and minerals around us, how we gather and understand and interact with the world, the material as well as the immaterial, as well as how all of that shapes the land back. And what we're dealing with current situation is a systemic fragmentation of this relationship to land. And I felt a lot of resonance with what Gopal was saying about that. Although we're using different languages, I feel like we're saying the same things. So this systemic fragmentation happens through fragmenting relationships, whether they're material or social, through these concepts of private property and ownership, as well as objectifying people and places as extraction zones. And I think it's important to talk about how this actually happens on more of a specific granular way. And just as an example, I thought to talk a little bit about laws here in the US. And there are so many laws to talk about and broken treaties. And I just listed a few here, some of the main laws that founded this country, really. The Doctrine of Discovery, Dawes Act, the Alien Land Laws, and redlining. And so these kind of like instruments of fragmentation that happen through laws have directly impacted how we live, gather, and shelter and feed ourselves. So you might or might not be familiar with redlining, but that's basically a form of racialized zoning. And that led to some of the first public housing projects concentrating Black families who had previously deep ties to Southern life in overcrowded dwellings, food apartheid, and health hazard areas. And we're seeing even now what's considered affordable housing many times goes vacant in rural areas because of the lack of other types of infrastructures and opportunities like jobs and food and things like that. And it just continues. These types of building codes, whether national or local, disregard cultural needs and offer no way for community to give feedback at the different stages of building. And according to the 2020 National Young Farmers Coalition Land Policy Report, the policymakers have specifically incentivized colonization of land for farming, acknowledging agriculture as critically important to continued food and national security. And so, because most wealth is inherited, these resources continue to get concentrated more and more in fewer hands. And I wanted to talk a little bit specifically about Santa Barbara. I was fortunate and blessed to live in Sirtun for 4 years, and my time there was focused a lot on working in housing and architecture. And it was clear to me very early on how this Spanish mission system really still shapes Santa Barbara in profound ways to this day. Everything from how housing is built, the materials used, the aesthetic. It centers this colonial narrative and just this romanticization. And also the historical narratives that are centered tend to erase Native voices, Chumash voices, other Native nations that have been and have interacted with this land, as well as Black and Brown and Asian and other marginalized, historically resilient communities. And you can see that in even like the fiestas and things like that. And even the farming culture all across California, the industrialized farming industry has its roots in the mission system, because the missions owned many, many acres of land as a whole network alongside the coastal mission network. So I just wanted to give a little specific reflection on Santa Barbara, and I'll try to, I only have 3 minutes, but I really do want to talk about how do we heal and truly decolonize from this fragmentation of land that really, for almost up until recently, has shaped how we house ourselves, how we feed ourselves, our relationships to each other's, our cosmologies. And when I think about healing, I have this image of reweaving this web of life, that it's safe again to hold all of us. Rena Swensel, a matriarch and architect from Santa Clara, said that through architecture, it can be a human expression which helps reveal the interrelationships of life. Thus, architectural form, values, lifestyle, culture, and worldview must all be aligned. And then, so if the standard building systems, if you look on the left, only consider basic things like heat and water and energy, a more integrated system would also consider future generations and water and possible loss of agricultural land and things like that. And then if we wanted to widen the circle even more and take in Rena Swensel's wisdom, building systems and how we shape our vessels that we live our lives in would also consider culture, material and symbolic meaning and memory, and how we gather. And then I think when we're thinking about creating these webs and mending them again, it also requires the abolition of systemic violence machines such as prisons and wars. And I think this quote by Ruth Wilson Gilmore kind of sums up this entire presentation, which is, abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. And I also want to give a nod to some of the work being done with current systems. So as we abolish the old and mend for the future generations, there's really worthy work and important work being done with advocacy, interacting with current laws. You may know Sasha, Quail Springs community. Her team has been conducting safety and heat cob testing. And cob is this very ancient technology and is used all around the world, and it's affordable, accessible, and fire resistant. So it's her and her team's effort to kind of legalize these traditional technologies, because it isn't actually, it's in a lot of places it's actually illegal because of it not being tested and not fitting into a sort of building standard. And just to quickly wrap up, I think this work of remembering our histories and returning and rematriating what is stolen and repairing trauma is continual work that we have to always be attending to. And I don't think it's a destination ever. I think we're always going to have to be working with that at different scales, from the interpersonal to the global. And I think my fellow panelists will cover a lot of this type of work. And yeah, this is how I'm asking myself to guide me through these really big and sometimes very intimidating visions and dreams of healing. I leave you with these questions. How do I cultivate more presence? How do I tend to life-affirming efforts, webs, and systems, considering past, present, future, power, and place? And yes, that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Sada. That was amazing and so exciting to share a little bit of your relationship with the work with natural building and what Sasha's been up to, and the Quill Springs folks trying to legalize cob. It's really powerful stuff. And thank you so much for starting us off with a breath. That was really grounding and so necessary. Koyo, if you are ready, go ahead and take it away.
Haku. It's funny how I sat up like, oh, that's me. Sala koyo kakti kapapani shumolok hilmikyu ke swahil hinakalamu hilimu Glek en hilmis kanakaten kushichish ke kakina Hiliti. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm really happy to be here. I'm like I was really excited to listen and learn from these amazing people. And I'm super humbled to be on the same panel as them. So I'm going to be talking about language sovereignty and how it relates to food sovereignty. It's something that I kind of had to figure out because like my experience has been with language. And so I've been learning my language since I was about 4 years old. And my language is Shmuich, Shumash, from Santa Barbara. So Shmuich is there's like 7 dialect, or so there's 7 languages within the Shumash, like our lands. And Shmuich is specifically from Santa Barbara. And then there's different dialects within that language. The Santa Barbara language is different from the Ventura language. Ventura is Mitskanakaten. And then it's different from there's like 7 different ones. So, and they're all distinctly different languages. When it comes to linguistic talk, yeah, it's how I have kind of equalized that, or equivalated that, is how Spanish and Italian are both like based in Latin, at least my understanding of them are. And so sometimes they can, if you speak Spanish, you can kind of understand a little bit of Italian, but not all the way, because it's some words are like distinctly different, but some things are a bit similar. So yeah, so Shumash is 7 different languages. And my father, I'm also Tonatem and Seri and Mayo and Spanish, of course, and Irish. And so my grandma's Tonatem, and the reason that my dad wanted me to learn Chumash culture is because our last fluent speaker had passed away in 1965. And so our language needed reawakening, our language needed love, our language needed, still needs revitalizing. So, and it's closest to, I grew up in LA, so it's the land that's closest to us. And my Nina, Georgiana Sanchez, she always says the land forms you. And so, yeah, so I was raised Chumash, and I started learning the language when I was 4 through songs. I'm also a songkeeper of our language, and yeah, so I'm going to be talking about that. And just wanted to give y'all like a brief, like kind of background on my experience with language. I started taking more official classes when I was like 8. So yeah, I've been learning the language and really trying to integrate it into my life. And I've taught a couple classes at work. And so yeah, that's my my own experience. So I wanted to talk about how, so basically language informs us, right? And so when I was kind of doing some research on how I'm going to integrate language sovereignty with food sovereignty, I literally just looked up sovereignty. And so when you're defining sovereignty, right? I the definition that that'll pop up if you just see sovereignty, right, is the authority of a state to govern itself or another state, or supreme power or authority. And that's like not something that I would necessarily define or like associate with when I talk about sovereignty. Another definition that I found from Indigenous Environmental Network, it, they said it consists of spiritual ways, culture, language, social and legal systems, political structures, and inherent relationships with lands, waters, and all upon them. Indigenous sovereignty exists regardless of what the nation state does or does not do. It continues as long as the people that are part of it continue. And so that's the kind of definition that I would use. And then, so my point right now is to say that language informs us on how to move through the world together. And so if we both agree on this definition of a word, then we can say, okay, now we know how to communicate. So even growing up, I needed definitions of things to understand people. So when we're defining other things, and this relates to food sovereignty because each component of culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. I'm reading my notes. But language really informs us how our food is medicine. It gives us spiritual health, how medicine gives us spiritual health, and language brings communities together as well as food. So when there's ever a gathering, most indigenous cultures will have food. I think most cultures in general will have food as a way to bring people together, and so does language. But yeah, so my examples of how that happens is, so some words for my language is hutash, which is the word for pupil of the eye, or our word for coffee berry. And it's also our word for the spirit of the Mother Earth. So hutash, we talk about hutash a lot. And so it's just always like wild when I hear other words being used for, or hutash being used for other things like pupil of the eye or coffee berry. And then another example that I found was atmin or atmin. It's the word for seed and the word for body or flesh or meat. And so people are always talking about how we are seeds. And so just to know that our language literally says that our body is a seed, like, or it's the same word for body and seed, is really deep. And so, like I said, our language informs us, and understanding these things teaches us about our relationship to the food as medicine, which is something that Gopal had said, right? Or it's all about relationships. And so language really teaches us how we relate to one another and how we move through the world, or how our ancestors did. So yeah, so then I wanted to talk about access. The Harrington notes, so JP Harrington went around and did a lot of interviewing of people mostly like West Coast. He kind of went around a lot of places though, and he interviewed a lot of different people who are still speaking the language, their languages, their indigenous languages. And so his notes now are, and they're all handwritten, and they're all very, very disorganized. And so now they're all have been scanned and put onto the internet, but it's not easily and readily available, and it's not user friendly at all. So we have had a couple dictionaries in the past. We had one in the 90s, and we have one now that kind of has been edited a little bit, at least for Shmooich. And so our accessibility, our accessibleness, we're not, the language isn't as accessible as it should be. And so that infringes on that, on our ability to learn the language and our ability to teach the language, and um, our ability to integrate it into our lives, especially when we don't have a word for something in the dictionary and there is actually a word for it somewhere. So in the same way that we don't have easy and readily available access to the language, we don't have easily and readily available access to land. Except for, which I want to just plug, Somosemias, which took a lot of energy to do. You know, people put in some work to be able to gain access to that land, where the garden is. And so it wasn't readily available, right? And I have access, thank God, to the Los Padres Forest, where I can gather, specifically me, but people don't, but that took a lot of work, right? That took relationship building, and it took them trusting us. But unless like, people like us aunties, right? My aunties proving to them, to like the forest, saying that like we do have an understanding of how to be with our plants in right relationship. And so I was gonna say that like land is foods, like contributes greatly to food sovereignty. So when we get access to our lands, we gain access to our plants. And my auntie Julie Cordero, who I'm gonna be like plugging a lot, or like giving credit to a lot, because she's taught me a lot. She's a teacher of mine, and she's an herbalist, botanist, and she says that our plants hold our teachings. And so when we don't have a word for like California sunflower, we can't find the word for that. And so we have to sit it, hopefully, you know, we can learn our language and sit with the plants, and we can relearn and we can remember, as Sarah said. I love that word, because when you're remembering, you're literally putting back like members of your body, right? Members of your spirit. You're putting yourself back together, you're remembering. It's such a beautiful concept. Whenever I talk about it, I tear up. But yeah, when we have access to our lands, then we have access to our plants and our medicines, and those teachings that come when we sit with our plants, and the teachings that come with that when we sit with our food and our medicines, they're the same ones that our ancestors sat with. And so they have a ton of knowledge that can help us to remember our language. And so, yeah. Oh, and Uncle, I wanted to share too, Uncle at ceremony said that our language is in the wind. We're at Oak Flat a couple weeks ago, and Uncle was talking, and he was like, you know, it's so important to be out on the lands, because the stuff that was stolen from us, it's still there. It's in the wind. You know, our language is on or in the wind. So yeah, we'd have space to be in place and grow relationships with our relatives if we had land, like readily and easily access to land. And so I just wanted to end with the Bee song, which is a song that, again, Julie Cordero, she was sitting in the back of her mom's old house, Roberta Cordero, and she doesn't live here. She doesn't live in Chumash. She lives up north in, I believe, Salish territory, outside of Seattle. And so she was sitting, just kind of being and closing her eyes and being with the land and listening. And because her mom's house had a ton of plants in the back, and she heard a bee come up, and the bee just kind of like was in front of her, just doing their thing. And so she heard the song from the bee, and it goes, it's a song that it's a tune, and then she put words to the tune, and the words to the tune are the names of our plants in order from, I believe, winter, yeah, and so in order of season, and it's like when the bees are pollinating all of these plants. So it's like within this language, we're understanding just how our plants work, and to see their relationship with the other beings that are around them. And so within that even is a teaching and a lesson and something to be learned. And so, yeah, so I'm gonna end with the song. So let me see if I always forget like just the beginning. So if I see the beginning, then I should be good with seeing the whole thing. And hopefully my cousins who are on this right now can sing along with me without cheating. Okay. Skoyon mashiko kaya saktayuhas molo what we shop kupe akiyep. Sho ilepesh sichon yepunesh kutash kapshi tokash tikolikol. Spasusupuk pa onchochi kills to eat manaksh mumomoy. Kwekim sartutun skoyon washiko pok aktayukas molo what we shop. That's all.
Awesome. Kaki Mali Koyo, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation and sharing the relationship between language and food sovereignty and that beautiful song. It's such an honor to get to have you with us here. Thank you. Next, we have Melissa Nelson, who will be presenting on Indigenous sovereignty and traditional ecological knowledge. If you are ready, Melissa.
Yes.
So, thanks for being here.
All right, shall I begin? I don't think my video's on.
You can begin. Yeah, I don't see your video. We see your a picture of you.
Yeah, I'm here. It says unable to start video.
Huh.
It says host has stopped video.
Oren or Jason, is that something that you could fix on your end in the back?
Ah, there we go. Yes, thank you.
Awesome.
All right. Well, Bujunin Dinoy Maganatug, I greet you all with a warm heart as my relatives. It was such a beautiful sharing already from my three co-conspirers here talking about economies and decolonization and language. So I really appreciate your words of wisdom. It's an honor to share space with you and be present with you. I'm calling in today from the beautiful lands of the Acamel Autumn and Piposh people of the Pima Maricopa Indian community, also known as the Salt River Valley of Phoenix, Arizona at Arizona State University. And I'm very honored to stand on their beautiful ancestral lands here in the Sonoran Desert. But I'm from where you all are in California and grew up in Sinkyone territory, born and raised there, Sinkyone and Yuki territory, and born in Ramaytush Ohlone territory, and live a lot in Coast Miwok territory. So it's just great to be connected back with all of you representing so many rich California places and cultures. So I want to share with you today a little bit about my work doing food sovereignty in California. And then I saw you put Indigenous sovereignty in 15 minutes. That would be a great challenge. And thank you to all of the previous speakers who shared some of the critical and brutal laws and histories, which is too much to go into in this short time. And I'll refer to it just indirectly, but that's not really the purpose. I want to talk more about contemporary movements and activities to assert food sovereignty in California. So here is just a little bit about the beautiful foods, iconic and sacred foods, the first strawberries and black acorns that are so important to all Native peoples, but especially in Native California with so many of the incredible tribes and communities. There we go. And to just give a little background, I greeted you in the language of my mother, Teresa Nelson, who just passed to the spirit world, and to my Anishinaabe relatives and ancestors of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. And we are people of the wild rice. And to ground this talk, I want to share with you a bit about my origins with the Manomin, the good grain of the Great Lakes area, and Gitchigami, the beautiful waters of Turtle Island. And also my band got moved out into the Northern Plains in the Dakotas, but we are wild rice people. We are the people who find the food that grows upon the water. And it's so important, if we're going to talk about sovereignty, to always talk about the fact that we are still here. And I was very honored in 2006, 7, and 8 to work with the group of Ohlone and Miwok and other California Indian folks and students and faculty at San Francisco State University to co-create this beautiful mural that really shows and demonstrates the power of Indigenous sovereignty, even in urban contexts, even when you've been given an extinction sentence by Alfred Kroeber and do not have federal recognition. As Indigenous peoples, we always can assert our sovereignty. So just a little quick rundown. Indigenous sovereignty is so complex, too much to go into, but we can all share a little bit window into this important concept that is not an Indigenous word, but it is an Indigenous concept about governance, guardianship, and protecting our people and protecting our lands. And I've heard from many elders that Indigenous sovereignty really is encapsulated in 4 major areas. 4 is a sacred number to a lot of tribes, my tribe certainly. And to have sovereignty, we must have a relationship with our territories, our ancestors, our ancestral lands and sacred lands, whether they are, enclosed in private property or on so-called public lands. lands like state parks or BLM land, or whether they are in tribal trust lands or allotment lands, to have a relationship, an active relationship with our traditional territory. So territorial sovereignty is foundational and fundamental to our sovereignty. Again, regardless of who owns it, ideally, of course, we have sovereignty and governance over our own lands to make decisions over them, but we know that that's not often the case, and that shouldn't prevent us from having a relationship to protect lands wherever they are. We must also have cultural sovereignty. We saw beautifully with the previous speaker how important language is for revitalizing culture and singing those beautiful songs and being able to sing to our plants and to our waters and to our ancestral sites. So cultural sovereignty is absolutely key. And that ties to our political sovereignty, our sense of self-government and the way we govern ourselves. For my tribe, that's a lot about our clan system, and many tribes have very elaborate and complex and beautiful clan systems for checks and balances and indigenous forms of democracy, so that the eldest in the room is heard and the youngest in the room is heard, and those with other abilities are heard, and it's their voices that help us govern appropriately and fairly. And then, of course, that leads to our spiritual sovereignty and our religious freedom. Do we have access to our sacred medicines or sacred sites? Can we pray without being threatened with being arrested? And sadly, we know that's not the case, because many of our sacred sites are enclosed in national parks and private property and places where mining companies want to enclose and extract. And yet we need to protect those spiritual sites and those sacred places. So that's another dimension of sovereignty.
Dr. Nelson, sorry to interrupt. Can you
Oh,
slow down just a touch?
okay.
Because the interpreters are having a hard time
Yes,
keeping up.
sorry. Yes, thank you. I usually talk slow, but I get all fired up with sovereignty. So those are 4 dimensions of sovereignty that really lead to our commitment to defend the sacred, as this image shows. I think that's at root for me. Defending the sacred is how I define the concept of sovereignty. And again, what is sacred is going to be different for each nation, each tribe, each community. And one way that we continue to assert our territorial sovereignty is through indigenous resource management, or what we often call tending the wild. As we know, in the beautiful west coast of Turtle Island, the rich biodiversity and bounty of the land meant that most tribes don't have to practice historically intensive agriculture, but did a form of agroecology, just kind of nudging and tending to the natural abundance that was already there, whether in oak woodlands or coastal prairies or grasslands. So this is really what I mean by traditional ecological knowledge, that indigenous people hold complex sciences for how to tend to gather, cultivate, manage, and love the fruits and plants and animals of the ecosystems in their home territories. So this is often called native science, TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, agroecology, or indigenous ecologies. There's many different ways of talking about this. Roxanne Swensel talks about indigenous permaculture at the Flowering Tree Center that was referred to earlier. And again, for many in California, this is about in situ tending and harvesting of the native species and habitats that are already there. In situ meaning situated, native, from that land, growing there naturally through natural processes such as birds passing seeds on, berries from one area to the next. And we know that much of California and much of Turtle Island was a bounty when the first colonists came here. They said it looked like a park, you know, but then there's no people here, terra nullius, empty lands. So there was this contradiction because they didn't want to acknowledge the millions of indigenous people here that were tending the land so beautifully it looked like a park. And they tended to it a lot through prescribed cultural burning or traditional fire management. And if our ancestors had been doing that, we wouldn't find ourselves in this brutal fire zone that we're in right now on the planet. We know that other techniques of TEK or traditional resource management include pruning and coppicing of the native plants that the beautiful basket weavers do with such care and attention and love and kinship. We know that there are incredibly important areas along the California coastline, rich in abalone and sea urchins and fish and lobster and mussels that really were a significant part of the California tribes on the coast. And sadly, many of the California tribes, like the Chumash, have been cut off from those traditional gathering sites. And it's important to practice the honorable harvest that Kat Anderson talks about, and also many other folks talk about how important it is to practice ethical tending and harvesting. Again, too much to go into now, but it often includes a lot of prayer and ceremony and reciprocity. And just to show some of the beautiful acorns from California, these are 3 different species, coastal live oak, tan oak, and black oak, 3 of the 20 acorn species in California that all have beautiful value as tasty, nutritious food. There are so many stories about the history of the relationship with the acorns as gifts from Creator and from Coyote and from other beings. And yet today we know that oak trees are suffering from sudden oak death and other diseases due to mismanagement and impacts of colonialism and agribusiness and so many other factors. So there's an effort to really revitalize the oak woodlands to make sure that they don't have too much die-off, although there's been tremendous die-off of some of the tan oaks in northern coastal California. And then going inland, the piñón, the beautiful pine nuts that are so important to the folks in the Sierra Nevada mountains and the foothills, and on the eastern side with the Paiute and the Shoshone over in the dry desert of the Great Basin, and that how important it is to gather these foods. And as many have shared, that even when the trees do not give fruit, you still give thanks to them. You still thank them for the abundance they shared previously, and to pray for abundance again in the future. So there's ceremonies to give gratitude to the piñón trees, even if there was a drought year and they cannot provide seed. We also know that as California is part of Salmon Nation going up into the North Country, and the restoration of salmon is so critical, the coho and the chinook that used to really fill the rivers of California, and we hope that they can fill them again. But sadly, so many species are endangered due to climate change and water pollution, over harvesting, and other factors. So for the tribes to really assert food sovereignty requires also watershed restoration to try to bring back the salmon and the other fish. Even way up north, this is in Nuchanolth territory on the west coast of Vancouver Island, that they are struggling also in their abundant rivers and coastlines with having enough salmon to harvest and share with their full communities. We also know that there's many politics involved with coastal gathering and sovereignty, asserting sovereignty on the coastlines that have become the playgrounds and the enclosures of, you know, the uber wealthy who love to buy property on the California coast. And even though we're supposed to have the California Coastal Commission and there's the California Coastal Act to assert freedom of, you know, movement going out to the coast, we know that the seafood gathering is strictly regulated by many different federal and state agencies. So it's very challenging to assert tribal sovereignty for food gathering on the coastline without threat of being arrested or fined for, quote, illegally harvesting in your traditional homelands where your ancestors, harvested for millennia. So because traditional gathering has become more and more challenging in California due to all the environmental, political, social issues, many are turning to agriculture, even tribes who weren't traditionally farmers, and the proliferation of urban farms and indigenous permaculture and seed saving and seed rematriation is just so wonderful. And we learn so much from our Southwestern relatives, from the Pueblos and the Navajo and Hopi and the tribes who have been farming for millennia, and the Northeastern tribes, the Haudenosaunee and the Seneca and Mohawk, who are just fantastic farmers. So we've been learning intertribal exchange of seeds to become farmers in urban context to assert food sovereignty. And
Sorry, Melissa,
Yeah.
just being reminded to, if you could slow down just a little bit for the
Yes,
interpreters,
okay.
please. Thank you. This
Yes,
is great.
sorry. So seeds are critical to helping assert food sovereignty today by contemporary indigenous communities in urban contexts and rural contexts. And COVID really laid bare how vulnerable we are to food distribution by others and the need to grow our own food for our own health and well-being. So through the Cultural Conservancy, the nonprofit Indigenous rights organization I've been a part of for nearly 30 years, we're lucky to grow these beautiful heirloom Native American seeds at Indian Valley Organic Farm and Garden in Coast Miwok Territory up in northern Marin County near Novato at the College of Marin, a community college. And we also just acquired a larger piece of land that we are so honored to steward in Coast Miwok in Southern Pomo Territory with their permission up by Sebastopol, Heron Shadow. And so there is a growing and beautiful intertribal urban youth movement that is reclaiming foodways and food justice. And we are exchanging seeds and knowledge and asserting sovereignty in very unique and novel ways, micro ways in a way, with small urban gardens. But anytime we have a relationship with the land and the first peoples of the land and native seeds, it really magnifies our sense of identity, our sense of heritage, and our sense of health and well-being. And again, the abundance and beauty of seeds is just so profound. Seeds teach us about generosity and about sharing and about trade. And they're just so abundant that it's easy to share and trade with many different communities. We have formed a network. The Slow Food Turtle Island Association is a network of Native American farmers, seed keepers, fishers, traditional gatherers throughout Canada, United States, Mexico, including Alaska, and of course, Hawaii. And we get together and share recipes and seeds and gathering techniques and berries, and teach each other about different ways to assert our food justice and food sovereignty. And this has led us to the international food movement of indigenous peoples from Bolivia to India, from Samiland in Sweden to Nicaragua to the Philippines and New Zealand, all around the world. Indigenous peoples are deeply concerned with the sanctity of their seeds, their sovereignty, again, all levels, territorial, cultural, political, and spiritual. And here's just an example of the Cultural Conservancy and some acorn bread we made. This is Maya Harjo, wonderful indigenous farmer up at Heron Shadow, where we are building our indigenous biocultural heritage farm and area. You're all welcome there. We'd love to host you. So really, it comes down to rematriation as an antidote to colonialism and to decolonization and the healing that has been spoken about. And there's many resources available with the Segurite Land Trust in the East Bay of Oakland with their wonderful rematriation resource guide. And on the right, this is a new video out by the wonderful Rowan White at Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance in partnership with the Cultural Conservancy. We produce Seed Mother Coming Home, a beautiful video about the seed rematriation movement and its relationship to land, health, and sovereignty. And for more information and to hear directly from some of these great partners we have, we've created the Native Seed Pod, an antidote to the monoculture. We've got 3 seasons up with conversations about many, many different folks, from Cree moose hunters to Mohawk seed keepers to Ohlone Cafe chefs. So that's a great place to get more information. And it's been an honor to be with you today. And thank you for letting me share these words and these models. And I look forward to some good questions and discussion. Miyu miigwech.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa. That was amazing. I just always really appreciate your presentations, just the wealth of knowledge that you have. And it was so sweet to see Maya in there. I was up at OAC during the course where we did the design project for the site. So
oh, yes, that's right. Last summer, which year?
it was like just before the pandemic, 2019.
Oh, yeah, the first one when we were just acquiring it, when we were just going through the process. Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. Yeah, so we are going to transition briefly for about maybe 10 or so minutes to our Q&A portion. And I'm going to hand it off to Chewy, who will be the one moderating the Q&A. And so take it away, Chewy, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, everyone who's presented today. Naritu School, buenas noches, good evening. My name is Chewy. Basically, I want to remind people that you can add any questions in the bottom left-hand corner in the Q&A. It can be comments or what have you. I'll start off with one question, and feel free to ask while we're answering the questions. We have about 10-15 minutes to be able to have a discussion. So if each response could be around 3 to 5 minutes. So the first question will be for Gopal. Essentially, this is kind of more of a comment, but kind of them wanting to hear a little bit more about you. So it states, this all sounds amazing. I sometimes struggle with how we make these transitions to different economic formats work while we still have to exist in the extractive systems, especially those of us that are more vulnerable and have less resources to access to support us through the shift. So Gopal, if you wanted to share any thoughts on that comment.
Sure, I'll maybe share briefly and also invite my amazing friends to also, if they have thoughts. And also just, was just so moving to hear all of y'all and to the different synergies. I think I want to start by saying that navigating contradictions is really the process of transition. Excuse me. As we think about what it takes to live into the world that we know we need and want, we still have to navigate the world that we're in. Excuse me, sorry. Having a little scratching my throat. And so, it's important that we do our best, but we also have needs that need to get met, and we're struggling to deal with that in the world that we're in. For me, the big shift and the big change in organizing over the last 20 years has been the change from fighting against what we don't want or making demands from existing structures of governance and economy to better meet our needs, even though it was never designed to do so, to actually organizing ourselves to directly meet our needs and demonstrate that we can actually self-govern and meet our needs. And for me, that's not about creating boutique alternatives that people with privilege can access, but as a different kind of organizing. Who are those most radically excluded from access to land, to housing, to well-being, to care, and how are we organizing ourselves collectively together to meet those needs and to create the systems that serve those, there goes the lights, San Francisco State, to meet the needs of those communities. So that to me is the key thing. And that is happening now. We're not happy to just say, we want you to do something for us. We are now, as a social movement, as organizing, embracing the leadership and wisdom of Indigenous communities, of Black communities, of undocumented immigrant communities who have been organizing to meet their own needs as direct action, as survival, as part of their struggle, as part of their work. And so, yeah, that for me is what I would say. Let's get organized together and not and work on how we meet our needs. Cooperative housing, energy democracy, food sovereignty. That's the organizing we need now. And it's not easy, but hard and bad are not the same thing. And I'm not sure if anybody else wants to add to that. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if any of the other panelists have anything they'd like to contribute to the question or thought.
That was pretty excellent. Go, Paul.
All right, thank you, Gopal, for answering that question. Yeah, I agree. It was very, very eloquent. So our next question is open to anyone who would like to answer it. It states, good evening. I was hoping to ask the question about food sovereignty and gender. I have noticed that it is a majority of women and queer people who are at the forefront of transition to more decolonial forms of living, especially through food. How can we sustain food sovereignty, housing, and language sovereignty when we are all still facing different forms of gendered violence? So yeah, if anyone wants to take on any of those points, feel free.
I'll start with that. Thank you so much for such an important question. And it is really timely and relevant that so much of the decolonial work is coming out of, women and queer folks, because we're decolonizing from, heteronormativity and homophobia, hypermasculinity, and those forms of violence. As I know all of the speakers, and certainly I'm sure many of you in the audience know that the violence against the land and the violence against women and queer bodies is absolutely linked in what I call conquest consciousness, that is a type of poison, almost like a mental illness, of, obsession with power over and domination and control. And sadly, that has been through many forms of colonialism, past, present, and hopefully not future, been impacting the diversity of the land and gender dynamics for far too long. So I think it's a very positive sign that women and queer folks, trans folks are really asserting their own forms of sovereignty by reclaiming our bodies, reclaiming our relationship with the land, reclaiming our relationship with seeds and foods, and collective forms of governance. And yet the horrible pattern of missing and murdered Indigenous women and gendered violence sadly continues. And I think that is one of the most significant forms of colonialism that we're facing today that really needs ongoing attention at the legislative level, at the community grassroots level. And certainly we need to decolonize the mind and decolonize from that conquest consciousness that continues to exploit land and people instead of heal and nurture each other. So I'll just share that for now and love to hear from my sisters, Sarah and Sarah and Gopal.
I would add to the last question about how do we continue doing this work while also facing violence in our own lives. I think my lesson lately, and it keeps on coming, is this need to take care of myself. Popular culture uses the term self-care, but I think it's a lot deeper than that. I keep on coming back to like, what does self-compassion look like? And that looks like different things for different people, I think, depending on how you grew up and what actually nourishes you. I think we all come from different cultures. So lately, I personally have been connecting to meditation and different forms of like mindfulness. And it sounds simple, but it's actually really powerful to connect into that and to connect to yourself daily as a ritual. I try to listen to myself and check in, and you can get lost in the work and forget to do that, and that leads to burnout. And we don't want that. we need to be tending to ourselves so we can tend to our communities. And yes, that looks like different things, prayers, different kinds of ceremony, rituals, and rituals can be simple. I think it could be waking up and drinking a glass of water in silence, for example. And that's my small contribution.
Thank you for that reminder. In Chumash, we all start. So winter is the new year, winter solstice, and I really see it as a time of reflection, and it's a reminder every year for me to start with myself. So thank you for that. And I think to answer the question, not or just at least partially, a big part of the community that I'm involved in, especially having done or like been on a few different front lines, is like harm reduction and creating safer spaces, and really figuring out ways of having accountability processes. And the processes, because we're gonna hurt each other as human beings, right? And so figuring out what to do when that happens, and and how to hold people accountable with love, and also to be like survivor centered, and to make sure that the people who were harmed are heard and listened to and taken care of. And that looks like so many different things in so many different ways, because it depends on the situation and the people involved. And so when there is violence that happens, especially in the communities that we're working with, right, that I think finding processes of accountability and figuring those steps out are really important while we're doing this work, of creating systems outside the system. So that's my little contribution too.
As a middle-aged, cisgendered, hetero male parent, for me, the learning and the wisdom of consent is really powerful. It is, I do not think, an accident or a coincidence that that free, prior, and informed consent is a foundation of indigenous sovereignty, that permission to pick the plants and to be in relationship with the plants is deep in the tradition, in the knowledge, and that consent is at the foundation of right relationship with each other in all of our relations, from the most intimate to the collective. And that's really, for me, this piece of Commons is fundamentally about being in consensual and cooperative community. And entitlement, enclosure, I don't know if you need to see me, enclosures are based on entitlement, the privilege, the power to take whatever you want from whoever you want. And so it is at the foundation of both the patriarchy and the privatization. So for me, it's all tied in together. And I would also remind us that while we live in patriarchal structures, we actually live in a fraternity in which all of the brothers have all of the privileges and all of the power of the patriarchs and take none of the accountability or responsibility. We just point away or provide cover for each other. And I think that's something that has to be broken in how we interact with each other, and as part of the fraternity. We can say we don't like it, but until we rebel against it, we're complicit.
Awesome. We are just about 1 minute away from 7. And there was one other question that came in, but around the acequias, unless someone has like a quick response to that, what are some of the ways that widely adopted non-Indigenous water systems contribute to fragmentation is the question. Maybe if someone has a quick response, I know none of these are easy to respond to quickly, but and then we'll have to wrap it up because we're right at 7. Yeah, maybe not. Great. Well, I just want to wrap us up here by expressing a tremendous amount of gratitude to the 4 presenters who came tonight and took the time to get on this call and share the just amazing wealth of knowledge and experience that you all have and bring, and the beauty that you all have shared tonight. And I also want to thank all the participants, all the people who showed up to get on the call tonight as well. And just lastly, we will be, this is recorded and we will be sharing this out with all registered participants, and we'll be sending out also a little bit of a resource guide based off the topics that were shared and some of the resources that were shared in each of the presentations. So you'll get a little follow-up with links to that, and also ways in which you can get involved in different projects in the Santa Barbara area that are around food sovereignty. So yeah, just want to thank everyone again one last time for being here. And yeah, have a good evening. Stay safe, everyone. And I'll see you out there. Good night.
Thank you, Daniel, and all. Take care.
Melissa, great to have you here.
Great to
All
see you
right,
all.
it's good to
Bye,
see you.
Gopal.
Bye, Melissa.
Bye. Good to see you.
Bye, Sarah.
Bye. Bye, Sarah.
Such a blessing
I
to be
thank
in
you for
space
your
with you.
song so much.
Yeah,
Coyo. That
thank you,
was
Sarah.
beautiful.
Thank you all.
Sarah, I'll see you in New Mexico sometime. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Beautiful.